Thank you for this invitation. I was surprised and happily surprised to hear that. I grew up just across the border in Westerly, a small Italian family of 6 children. And, I love this area. I grew up coming to the borough, and I love my hometown. It's changed so much. I mean, we didn't have a lot of, I went to downtown Westerly today, and I was like, where was this when I was a kid? We had Nyanza and Grants and S&H green stamps. And now there's bookstores, cafes, and my gosh, and look at this beautiful center, it's stunning. So it was really special to come back and to see the new commitment to the arts and culture in our neighborhood. So I'm thrilled to be here. The book that I'm going to talk to you about this evening, I always think the best things in life are surprises and serendipitous. I never planned to write this book. It's the most historical book that I've written. It is I've written often about Italy, that's been a constant, but I never planned on writing a book about this particular place. So the way my career evolved, just to give you a little bit of background, I started out, I'm a professor of literature. I did a PhD, and my first 2 books were very scholarly and very, very heavily footnoted. So I remember when I gave my mom my first book that took me like 10 years to write, I was like, here you go. I gave her a present, and she looked at it. She's like, grazie, figlio mio. Thank you, my son. And then she put it on a shelf like it was a vase of flowers. The spine of the book never to be opened. I ended up writing 2 very personal books after that. One I'll talk about. The other one was called My 2 Italys, which was the story of my family's. My parents are both immigrants. My siblings were born in Italy too. I was born in the United States. But the first 4 siblings of my family were born abroad, and I ended up going back to Italy, lived in Florence, studied Italian culture, ended up writing about it and teaching. So I talked about the collision of those 2 worlds. But I wrote those books when I was fairly young, and I started to think, well, I can't keep writing these memoirs. I remembered when I got my first job before Bard, I taught at Penn. And I was driving to an event there with a senior colleague that I was very intimidated by. And I said to him, we were going to honor this recently retired faculty member. I said, so what was this person like that we're going to honor? And he shot me a look. He said, he wrote 8 books about himself. What do you think he was like? And I thought, that's not going to be me. I'm stopping at 2. I felt I needed to switch gears, and writing for general readers was kind of intoxicating after writing these very scholarly books. So my career became more about writing about cultural institutions, historical entities, literature, but in a way that opens it up for non-academic, non-specialist authors. And that happened in this book. This book is even more complicated because it's about a place that I walk by thousands of times, because I've spent a lot of time in Florence. And our story begins here. Some of you may have walked by this wonderful corner of this building here, which I will show you. This is the Hospital of the Innocents. Okay? This is basically the first standalone orphanage in Europe. Hadn't existed before. There'd been churches that took in children, there'd been hospitals, but never a sort of civic state-run organization. And now, as I always tell my students, you see those beautiful arches in the front of it? They're designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. Boy, talk about like artistic imprimatur. Brunelleschi designed the Duomo. And you see those blue and white figure statues above? Those are by Della Robbia, another famous artist. Imagine if you are a child today and you are a ward of the state and you don't have parents. Do you think you'll go to a building like that? You won't. You'll go to a building that will resemble an institution. Someone once said they look more like prisons than actual care facilities. Like, you go to a stark building. I know people who work in those places do their very best, and they're doing incredible work, but it's hard to imagine that you would surround a child with this kind of art. And this is what this building did, and I knew about this building, and I knew the story about it. I knew that, you see that grate there in the picture. At one point in history, you would have to put the child in by passing its head through that grate. And if the child were small enough, it would fit in that grate. If not, they couldn't take it. And it would land on an old wagon wheel that would then transport it inside. So you could anonymously leave children there. And this was a great innovation because there were so many unwanted children in Renaissance Florence. I've been teaching the Renaissance for years. I've written a book about Botticelli. I didn't realize the extent to which unwanted children were everywhere. I didn't realize the extent to which Renaissance Florence had an enormous slave population. Servants who were often sexually violated by their masters. Children, that they used the term illegitimate back then, born out of wedlock. Children were abandoned on church steps. They were often flung on garbage heaps. They were trafficked sometimes. They were exposed to the elements. Remember, there was no birth control. It was the church told you, be fruitful and multiply. And so you had children that just couldn't be cared for. So the Florentines decided to take a stand, and they set up this orphanage in 1410. It was created. It took in its first child in 1445. It would go on to care for 400,000 children over the next 400 years, until around the 1980s, when it transitioned to being a museum and a children's study center. So it's an incredible humanitarian. There's so much bad news in the world. And I love this because it's a humanitarian story. It's an uplifting story. It shows what people are capable of their best. There's a lot of heartache associated with this place. When a mom would drop off the child, she would often break a coin in two, like this one you see here, leave half with the child and keep half for herself, and hope that one day they would be reunited. Unfortunately, that didn't happen too often. More often than not, poverty, illness, death, circumstances prevented these broken families from healing. And yet, at the same time, there was a lot of healing done at the Hospital of the Innocents. This became the symbol, the swaddled infant. And some of you have seen it. It's on the top of those arches, which we'll come back to. This is by the famous sculptor Della Robbia. It became a center for medical research. Some of the first courses taught in pediatrics, in first surgeries on children were done there, first school of obstetrics, some of the first vaccines for children. It was such an incredible contributor to the welfare of children that 400 years later, when the American Academy of Pediatrics chose a symbol, it chose the swaddled child by Della Robbia. I argue in my book that there was a transition in the notion of childhood in the Renaissance. To illustrate this, take a look at this painting here. This is from the 1200s, okay? It's a famous painting by Duccio di Buoninsegna, a wonderful medieval painter. Take a look at that baby, though. That's one old-looking kid, okay? That kid looks middle-aged. And many have argued that in the Middle Ages, there wasn't a conception of childhood the way that we have now, of the tender years. They were, more often than not, often considered imperfect little adults in the Middle Ages, on their way to becoming Christians in Europe. Something changes in the Renaissance. There's a whole interest in childhood as a state of on its own, worth studying, worth understanding. What we understand as childhood today, the long, slow path to maturity, I hear so often now that, I teach college, I'm often told by parents of my students that the students move home after college now. That was unthinkable in the Renaissance. You grew up fast. The long, slow path to maturity of a child, that was the province of the Renaissance one-percenters, the truly wealthy, the plutocratic. The idea of a middle-class childhood with lessons and leisure and play, that was off limits to almost everyone. But this institution helped change that. It gave not only children, but abandoned children. As I wrote this book, I came to see that the best index of a society's humanity is not how anyone can be nice to someone with money and power, because you can get something from them. That's no big deal. It's how you treat the most vulnerable members of your society that define you as a culture. And these children were vulnerable. They had no rights. Now, I vaguely knew all this because, as I said, I studied in Florence, I lived there, I've spent a lot of my career studying Dante. Talk about like a severe looking guy, right? You don't want to get on Dante's bad side. You end up in hell, right? So I knew about the Hospital of the Innocents. And yet one day in 2019, a few years ago, I had lunch with a friend, and we took a walk to this beautiful building. But there's beautiful buildings everywhere in Florence. Who's been to Florence? So many of you. I mean, it's hard to stand out. As I wrote in my book, it's a city prodigal of beauties. They're everywhere. But this one particular day, I stood with my friend, and I looked at those arches and those swaddled infants. And I could feel the lives of these rescued children course through me like an electric current. I just felt it for the first time. And I did because, and this is a book that I wrote, I too, years ago, had produced a little innocent, a vulnerable child. In 2007, my late wife, Catherine, had a fatal car accident, and she was 8.5 months pregnant. And 45 minutes before she died, she gave birth to our daughter, Isabel, who was miraculously rescued by an emergency cesarean. Now, you can imagine, as I wrote my book In a Dark Wood, I left the house that morning at 8. I wasn't in the car, and then by the time I got to the hospital, by noon, I was a widower and a father. And I was so shattered by grief that it was difficult for me to embrace fatherhood because I was grieving the sudden loss of my wife. I needed help raising my daughter, and help came in the form of my mom, Yolanda Luzzi. Westerly, this is my mom's Italian ID card. And if you see under professione, it says casalinga. Casalinga is Italian for housewife. And my mom raised 6 children, multiple grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And the night of the accident, she announced to the family that she was going to help me raise my daughter at 80, basically. And for the next 3 years, she did work that a young mother did. And that hit me that day, standing in the square, that I had produced a child that needed help, and it came in the form of my mom. This place did this on a massive scale. This was the last caregiver resort for the unwanted children of Florence. Children born of slaves who had been seduced by their owners or violently, sexually violated by their owners. Servant girls who suffered the same. Women who had an affair and a child that they couldn't raise, poor parents, you name it. There were many different categories, but they were all children who needed a hand. And the philosophy of this place was, imagine you're a child and your world is chaos. Let's say you're born of a slave woman and a powerful man who doesn't want to see you. The minute you cross those arches, you were no longer an unwanted child. You were a figlio di Firenze, a child of Florence. And think of the suggestion of those arches. What does that suggest? That suggests order, beauty, and dignity, as opposed to chaos, violence, and neglect. That was the message that this place sent. And when I felt it that day, because of my mom's legacy, I felt I had to write this book. And I learned that these children in the Renaissance, the shadow of death was everywhere. You know, you read about the Middle Ages that life expectancy was 35. That doesn't mean that 35-year-old people were dropping dead. Not that at all. It means that the average was so low because so many children died in childbirth. So many mothers died giving birth to children. If you made it into your 30s, you usually lived on into, you know, old age was 60s and 70s, but that was common back then. But it was so common for children to die young that something had to be done. And the Florentines knew it. And so they started to think of a way to create a standalone orphanage. But it's the same issue with philanthropy today. You have to find a donor. You have the idea, you need a donor. And they found one in an unexpected place. Do you see the man in the bottom left of the painting, bigger than the other people? Yeah, that's Francesco Dattini, who I call the merchant of penance, instead of the merchant of Venice. He was the richest man in Tuscany, the Warren Buffett of Tuscany. He had more money than he knew to do it. He had a vast empire throughout Italy, and he was not a good man per se. He cheated on his wife. He had children with a servant, with a slave. He treated those children originally terribly. He was a difficult person. But toward the end of his life, he started to feel a real fear. And this was typical, that no matter how wealthy he wasn't going up there. He was going down there. And this was real, pervasive in the Renaissance, because it was a Christian Catholic culture. And so his spiritual advisor wrote him a letter, and I love this letter, I'll quote it. Francesco, I have considered your state 100 times since leaving your house. I have already heard from you through letters of the anxieties and obstacles placed before you by the things of this world. God has given you an abundance of earthly goods and 1,000 warnings to awaken you. You are nearing 60. That wasn't the new 40 back then. Free from thoughts of children, and would you wish to wait until you are at death's door, when the latch of death will be open, to undergo a change of heart? His spiritual advisor's message was clear. You don't have children of your own. Help these unwanted children. Give money, create the orphanage. And he did exactly that. In his last will and testament in 1410, he bequeathed 1,000 gold florins for the creation of this first orphanage. There was a lot of pride behind this for the Florentines. Florence was one of the most powerful cities in Europe, but it was also small, and it felt it had to make up for its size by its art and its glory. It considered itself the most beautiful city in the world. And so they said, we want to decorate this orphanage by hiring Brunelleschi, by getting the greatest artist imaginable. And they also decided to enlist its great leaders, Leonardo Bruni, who is a great orator, who said, we have a responsibility as Florentines. We can't just rest on our cultural laurels. We have to show that we are worthy of holding our head high when we go into the next world. So a lot of it was motivated by Christian fear, and Christian responsibility, but it wasn't a Christian organization. That's really important. In the past, abandoned children were helped by churches, they were helped by hospitals, but this was the first time the state was doing it. And why did they do it? Well, think about it. If you've read Shakespeare's King Lear, there's that famous soliloquy by Edmund, who's illegitimate. We don't use that word illegitimate anymore, but he's born out of wedlock. And Edmund says, you know, why brand they us with baseness, bastardy? That word bastard, that awful word for people not born to married parents. Whereas Edmund's half-brother Edgar was born to married parents and enjoyed all the perks and privileges of that. This was typical. If you were born to unmarried parents, you weren't even a second-class citizen. You were a no-class citizen. You had often no rights at all. So what they tried to do in this orphanage was change the discourse. Some of you may know people named Innocenti or Esposito or Colombo. Those are all names that were given by these orphanages to people whose last names they didn't know. People of unknown. Esposito means exposed, put out. Innocenti means innocent, you're born without guilt. These are names that the orphanage gave to restore dignity to children who had been robbed of it. I mean, writing this book in some ways was a painful experience because I learned that there was this dark Renaissance. We think of the Renaissance, at one point I wrote, you know, that the glories of the Renaissance were often built on the backs of exploited slave labor and their sweat and their suffering. This is Carlo de' Medici, whose father was one of the powerful founders of the Medici Bank, but he was born to a slave woman who his father kept openly, and the women were supposed to accept that. This is a rare case where someone was able to rise because he had so much power behind him. But in general, the children born of these slaves did not have any such luck. I'll read you, the children couldn't say their side of the story. A challenge in writing this book is that you have to rely on what my 8-year-old daughter Annabelle calls the grown-ups. The grown-ups write everything down. The children, you don't hear their side. That's what was one of the challenges writing this book. How do you reconstruct those voices? But a lot was written about these children coming in. This is a pretty typical entry that the staffers of the Innocenti kept. On the 6th of December, 1451, there were brought to us at the Innocenti 2 female children, born in one body, twins, at 1 o'clock. They were baptized at once and given the names of Sandra Innocente and Nicolosa Innocente. They came from the house of Agostino Caponi. That's like saying Kennedy. That's a famous name in Florence. One of the top aristocratic names. There's streets named after him. This is like the glittering Florentine aristocracy, okay? They were born of his slave, Polonia. Polonia is Italian for Poland, and they named the slaves after where they came from. So this is so typical. He's in an uber wealthy home. Someone in the home has a child with a slave. They offload the kid. This is the pattern. They were brought by the midwife, wrapped in 2 linen rags without being swaddled. They arrived half dead. If they had been 2 dogs, they would have been better cared for. That's the reality. This is the dark Renaissance. Now, the hospital of the Innocents did what it could. It took in men, it took in boys, it took in girls. It restored their innocence. It often called them innocents. And most important of all, I think, it surrounded them with beautiful art. This is by Ghirlandaio. This was commissioned to hang in the collection of the Innocenti. And if you look, it's an extraordinary, beautiful painting. And if you see the beautiful robes of the people in the front, those didn't come from TJ Maxx. Those are elegant silk clothes because the patrons of the Innocenti were the silk weavers. And so in a way, they're kind of advertising a little bit. But this shows you this belief that they wanted to surround the children with art. And if you look at some of this is another painting by Ghirlandaio. Do you remember that old baby Jesus in the beginning? Look at now the children here. Do you see how childhood is being represented sort of more naturalistically? I call Ghirlandaio a poet of childhood because he was one of the great representatives of those tender years. And they not only fed and nourished the children, they educated them. This is a typical day in the Innocenti. This is a painting by Pocetti. Do you see the classroom in the back right? And you see the girls bringing those books to the kind of powers in the right. So men and women were both, boys and girls. The boys got more of an education than the girls, that's true. But the girls who were the most vulnerable, they actually helped them get married. They had to give them a dowry. It's not like today. You had to actually pay the family that was marrying your daughter in the form of a dowry, and this orphanage came up with that. So if we look back on the legacy of the Innocenti over the years, what I would say is there were a lot of imitators. It became famous. It became super famous because of the collection of its art, because of its sort of association with these great Renaissance thinkers. And so a lot of people tried to copy it as the unwanted children became an ongoing problem. But you've read Oliver Twist. You remember, please sir, can I have some more? And poor Oliver gets, you know, I don't know what, I remember exactly, but like a spoon thrown at him or something. The conditions in most orphanages were terrible. In rare cases did they succeed the way the Hospital of the Innocents did. It became legendary for its efficiency and its humanity, and in a way it became kind of inimitable. I would say that by the end of the book, I felt that we think about the Renaissance for its beautiful art, its architecture, its literature. I think what they did for children is one of the great achievements of this era, that there was a revolution in childcare, that the way we thought about children was new. And I can explain that by two words in Italian. When they came in, they were called gittatelli, and that means discarded ones, gittatelli. When they left, they were trovatelli, which means discovered ones. From discarded to discovered. I wish I could say that we've solved the problems today, that as we are a much wealthier, more evolved culture, that abandoned children don't exist, but I can tell you, every year in the United States, tens of thousands of children are still abandoned. And some of the debates are the same ones that they were having 500 years ago. There were some successful imitations. The London Foundling Hospital in the 18th century used the music of Handel, the art of Hogarth, to help rehabilitate children. So there were some successful ones. But I want to close by showing you a slide that I think encapsulates this ongoing struggle. This is a slide, not in Renaissance Florence, but in 21st century America, okay? And I think it will surprise you. That's in Carmel, Indiana, and that's contemporary. That is a baby box. There are places in America where you can leave a child anonymously. And you remember that crate I showed you at the beginning? The same debates about the grate and the wagon wheel are being had about this. 500 years ago, people said, wait a minute, you can't let people drop off children anonymously. That creates moral hazard. That makes it too easy for a parent to offload an unwanted child. But the other side would say, no, no, wait a minute. If we don't have a place like this, the child could be harmed. So we need to create access for abandonment that is anonymous. Everyone has to decide in their own heart where they feel on this. But it's the same debates we're having now in the United States about these baby boxes. Some people think they are necessary, that they are there to help unwanted children. Other people believe they make it too easy for parents to do the, this incredibly, complicated act of abandoning a child. By the time I finished the book, I got the idea of writing it when I thought about my mom, and my mom passed away a few years ago. And soon before she died, one of the last times I saw her, I went to see her with my youngest daughter, Sophia. And I love this photo because it's the generations, my mom and me and the youngest, and that care is something you hand from one generation to the next. When my mom died, I was asked to say a few words at her funeral, and without knowing why, I chose to end this extraordinary woman's life with a quote from Dante, the very end of the Divine Comedy, where Dante talks about the world. He talks about l'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle, the love that moves the sun and all the other stars, this vision of the world held together by cosmic love. When I went to do research at the Innocenti in 2023, I came across an exhibit of visiting school children, and they left notes about their experiences in the Divine Comedy. I'll read you that passage and then I'll close, okay? A few months after the funeral, I visited the Innocenti and came across an exhibit that asked visiting school children to share their thoughts and impressions about the Renaissance foundling home. The responses were as varied as one would expect, from random declarations like, Ti amo Ettore, I love you, Hector, to heartfelt expressions like, Oggi è un giorno speciale, today is a special day. I bambini sono più grandi di quanto pensiamo. Children are more grown up than we think. Then there was one that felt dropped from above like a gift from my mom. A spare phrase in block letters in blue ink that repeated my parting words to her from Dante. Words that seemed to lay bare the Innocenti's mission as it aimed for the heavens while often foundering on the planet Earth of human corruption and thwarted ideals. L'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle, the love that moves the sun and other stars. Thank you so much.